Hello, I'm Tony McCauley and welcome to this Medics Voices conversation, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today I'm talking to Fabian Dupont. Fabian, you've had a fantastic, fascinating career, but let's start at the beginning. What brought you into medicine?
What brought me into medicine? I think I always wanted to be a doctor. When I finished secondary school, I think I was a bit hesitant because I wanted to do something with many different languages and international experiences, which made me doubt whether medicine could be it. But then I actually realized at the end of the day, medicine is probably the only subject where you can combine one field with something that combines many people all over. And I think that's what made me even more interested in medicine. So after secondary school, I guess I liked it because I wanted to see how medicine was done in different fields of the world.
So did you go straight to university? And tell me, what was university like?
Well, I want to do medicine, but I want to have the international side to it. My surname is French, and people for some reason everywhere expect me to speak fluent French. Back then I didn't, so I decided I would start medical school in French, because the best way to actually learn anything about a country and also its language is probably just to live in it and work or study in it. And that was my way into medical school. And I learned a lot about the French culture, about around learning and medicine, which is very different to how it works in Germany, especially when it comes to medical education, the approach to it. And I went back to Germany to continue my medical school. And I think this is when it really kind of kicked off. And I spent quite some time at a large number of different medical schools around the world, trying to fit as many international experience in as I could. I really didn't plan it in that way, but every time there was a remote suggestion anywhere, this could be done in another country, I was the first to put up my hand and say, yep, I want to do it. And so I ended up going to many different places in my undergraduate studies. Yeah.
Well, that's really remarkable. Tell us, how did that work? And I mean, did your university, were they prepared to accredit all this travel?
Well, so I think, well, I did go to medical school where they were fairly accommodating to international experiences, yes, and that was definitely a conscious choice I made. I really liked that they would go the extra mile to make sure things were accredited. But normally that would apply to maybe one semester abroad, maybe one semester and one internship abroad. It was definitely not meant for, I think, overall 13 different medical schools that I got to go to. That was definitely not what their kind of approach was, but it made it easier. And to be honest, I think what made it possible in the end was, besides that I got really help, I got a lot of help funding it by different organizations, but it was a change in my approach to going abroad. Many times people would say, well, it's quite unlikely that this will be recognized. Or people would say, well, this is we can't guarantee that this is going to be accredited to your degree. And when that phrase came, I kind of smiled to myself and I said, well, all right, let's see about that afterwards. And I would say in 80%, it was fully accredited to my degree. Some things weren't. But at the end of the day, I think you learned so much more during these experiences that, in quotation marks, I might have lost half a year throughout medical school, but I got so much more out of it, I think.
Well, 13 medical schools, that is pretty cool. How do you learn medicine in a language that you're not fluent in?
So that's a very good question, and there are two sides to it. So the academic medicine part, that's easy. It sounds paradox, but that's the most easiest part of being in another country, because most of the words derive from Latin. It's very academic. Academic languages, they are always very straightforward. It's always the same structure. A class is always the same structure. There's always the same. If you have understood the curriculum, you know there's going to be this exam, this is going to be relevant for the exam, and you can go and move forward with that quite easily. You need fairly little of a country's knowledge to follow an academic program, my perspective. But to actually have a meaningful conversation with someone in the supermarket, that's where it gets hard. It gets hard when you go to a GP practice and you need to understand the ulterior motive of someone coming in. Well, it's not about the back pain. It's not about this. That's the actual excellence in language or in communication, really. Your question was, well, how did I learn? The medical part, the academic part was the easiest. It was having this social interaction and having beers with friends where everyone talks at the same time. That's the part where language is very complicated.
So you've completed medical school and you went down the specialty beam.
I was quite keen to go down the beam of neurology, or at least the academic part of going into that direction. But during the research, I think I realized the thing that I actually liked most, and I think it might have come up a couple of times now. I really like the education and the communication part. I really liked much more than the raw data or working with Excel sheets. I preferred educating people about. I spent quite some time in Uganda and East Africa, and we did a tropical medicine study on neurocystic psychosis there, and I really enjoyed the community education part of this program, much more so than actually sitting down, working the numbers. I know it's necessary, and I like it now as well, but it's what made me doubt whether neurology was really where I wanted to end up in. And the reason for that, I think, as well, was there was a big lack of role models that I could identify with. Another topic that became very important later in my work. And I realized medical education was the thing. So I decided to go into medical education and primary care, because I think that's primary care is the only subject where you can teach general medicine, because general practice essentially is general medicine.
You're very modest in your description of your career, because clearly as a doctorate in neurology and going down that specialist pathway, you were a bit of a high flyer. So I want to ask you about something else. Tell me about the Max Weber program.
Well, yeah, so Germany has a few scholarship programs. They're quite helpful when you want to go overseas, if you want to go and spend time abroad, because it's very costly, especially I think I went twice to the US, and the US is crazy expensive when you look at how much it costs on a daily basis. And I was very lucky that they have a scholarship foundation in Germany, and so there's a national scholarship foundation. There's also a regional scholarship foundation. Max Weber is one of the scholarship foundation, or the regional scholarship branch of the national German scholarship foundation that helps students go abroad. Yeah, it's a program that is essentially accompanying your study, and they have many different tracks that you can choose. So there's the financial part, which is, thank you, very grateful. Then there's the networking part, which is very helpful, because it helps you to get into contact with people who might help you organize things, which was very helpful for the abroad experiences, because you need to have people on the other side to get to these places and actually have things accredited. And then there's also the curricular aspect to it, and that's it was very meaningful. There were soft skill classes. They had academic education classes where you would learn about how academia works, and you were able to actually start your own seminar series within the network. So we started a seminar series on, it was called Spotlight Neurology back in the day, which was quite successful. It was implemented all over the country afterwards, and essentially it brings students and professors together who are very keen to share their current work and research and talk about what they do.
So this is clearly an academic leadership program for high flyers, which you've taken on to the next stage. Tell me about your leadership journey, because you started off with the German Federation and now you've moved to the international sphere.
After medical school, I did this master's program in medical education because I felt this medical education element was really important to me, and it wasn't many people who I talked to would tell me, well, that's a fun side hobby to have, but it's not an academic role. If you want to do research, you have to do real research. When I think about it now, I smile about that statement, because medical education is a key element, I think, of academia and a university's role. But that was, I think, the first step. Well, I had done quite a bit of international experience, but then after medical school, the first element was to actually go to Maastricht and do the Masters in Medical Education. I think that was the first step into the international world as a doctor, I think. And at the same time, I did my primary care training in Germany. So I kind of had these two roles at the same time, and that was the first step into it. And then I'd never heard about WONCA, never heard about EYFDM or Vasco da Gama. That's what it was called back in 2018. And the reason I actually went to the first WONCA event in Bratislava, I think, was that they had a Junior Researcher Award, and I had back then, I still think it's very interesting, but I thought a really good idea on a competency-based blended learning curriculum for primary care, and how you can implement that well into a undergraduate medical curriculum in Europe. And there's a education and research track to it, and I presented that, and I got elected as I got the Junior Researcher Award for it. And that was my first contact to EYFDM, and I actually really liked the people. And then I met a lot of people who said, well, medical education, we don't really have a special interest group. Isn't that something that you might want to be part in? And then I got elected as the council member, and one thing followed after the other. And then I guess I'm here now, and we've started our podcast. We have a few research projects on medical education in the EYFDM network, and yeah.
Okay, tell us about your innovations in communication. I'm interested in your podcasts.
So after this competency-based blended learning curriculum was presented, COVID hit us, which was a very bad thing for society. But for medical education, in many ways, it was very good. And we'd been working on it for 2 years, implementing all these modules, designing all the cases for the students and also the professional actors. And then COVID hit us, and we were really far advanced in establishing a blended learning curriculum, which we actually got to implement very quickly. And the university was very fast in accepting this as the main program within a couple of months, because there was nothing else around, which was good, because then I actually got the opportunity to be in a role where I could actually make educational decisions and changes. And one of the things that we had implemented in this program was also an accompanying podcast in Germany. That was it's a primary care podcast focusing on clinical presentations. That was our first step into podcasting. And I mean, it's a medical podcast, so it doesn't have the biggest reach. It's got about 32,000 people listening to it, I think. But that's how we actually got interested in podcasts, and we also realized that we called it the Instagram effect. For some reason, these people had listened to that podcast sometimes repeatedly to prepare for the exam, but they've also done that in a very different setting than where you would normally read a medical textbook or where you would listen to a lecture. And it was a very asymmetric relationship somehow, because everyone was at home during COVID, but then these students felt really close to specific lecturers, and any kind of learning message that they would convey would mean quite a lot to these students. So we actually came up, well, we did a parallel research track on the competencies of the future, and then one of the competencies that were quite important for European young GPs were doctors and patients' well-being, and did another workshop. And this kind of led back to the idea of role modeling. And that's when we had the idea, well, actually, one of the role modeling effects that we saw over COVID was this, well, Instagram effect, where people recognize you, but you as a lecturer don't necessarily recognize the people who speak to you. And so we decided to do a study on how people consume podcasts, especially when it's about medical career advice or professional identity formation. And we proposed that to the UFDM Council a couple of years ago, and they were quite keen to actually try it out. And then we got a grant from Saarland University, my home university. And so we got this podcast started in Sydney last year. And well, it started this year, but we started recording and preparing for it in Sydney last year. And that's how we got into that podcast, and we're doing a study on it. If you have a look on Spotify, UFDM podcast, or on Apple Podcasts, you can see the study and also listen to our podcasts.
Now, finally, let me ask you about something else that you've alluded to in the conversation, but which is very close to your heart and mine, and that's about the well-being of young doctors and how we build that into their future education.
If we look at medical education and how we see it today, and also if we look at the challenges that that are going to face our population and also primary care, we have a scarcity of workforce. We have a severely stretched workforce as it is. We'll have an aging population in many countries, and then also we have things happen to a healthcare system, either be it politically or by a pandemic, that stretches our workforce even further. And then to top it all off, we train our medical graduates for more than a decade to be competitive, to go into a selection process, to always give 110%, to reduce their personal well-being for just so they can pass an exam, so they can get to the next step. And it gets to a level where that is very threatening to the person itself behind it, because life happens at the same time and people forget about life happening at the same time. And we have a big problem of people dropping out. We have a big problem of people not working full time. We have a big issue with people being overworked or going into burnout. And we have an even bigger problem, I think, if all this is taken together and extrapolated for the next 2 or 3 decades, then we will have a major problem. So I think there's definitely a change that we need to go through as a society, but also especially as doctors, because we train each other in a way to forget ourselves during that training. And if you speak to older doctors, very few have found their sweet spot and they're very content, but very many are also very frustrated, also very overworked, feel like they're being pushed around by bureaucracy, by patients, by standards that they have to uphold, and they feel they feel very little self-efficacy in their daily lives. And that's something that we need to change, but the way we change it, it won't be, no one can just change it at some point and say, well, we only need to, this is the only button we have to press. There are many different things we have to change, and I think the cultural change towards well-being and making this a key element of our future curricula is one of the key elements that we need to address, especially as an organization. So it has organizational changes, it has personal changes, but it also has to. There needs to be a cultural change in how we see doctors and being a doctor.
Fabian, thank you very much. That's a wonderful message to end on the well-being of doctors. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks.